And welcome to 8 in the morning, everybody. Thank you very much for for joining us today in this session about VMPs and water quality. Anytime I get the chance to talk about water quality issues, freshwater ecosystems, especially when it involves a system very near and dear to my heart in Grand Lake St. Mary's, I kind of jump at the chance. So I very much appreciate the invitation to come talk, and again, I appreciate you all coming to attend. Grand Lake St. Mary's Watershed is one that is sort of the focus of the next 45 or so minutes of our lives, and it's a system that many of us, especially those of us in the Midwest, are extremely familiar with. It's a system that many of us are familiar with because of many of the water quality issues that have kind of plagued the region over the course of better than the last decade. This presentation is going to go over a series of sort of historical narrative facts, historical standings of the watershed, and then talk about some of the long-term changes over the last decade or so that we've seen in water quality, some of the real improvements. And these improvements are, right there on the ground in Grand Lake St. Mary's, but they're not improvements that necessarily have to stay in Grand Lake. There's nothing particularly localized about any of the improvements that we're going to talk about. So these are systems and these are improvements that can be kind of spread out really to almost any watershed area that you'd like to think about. Grand Lake St. Mary's watershed is a fairly small watershed. It's 250 or so square kilometers. It's pretty much right here in northwest Ohio. It's in Mercer and Auglaize County. And I'll tell you that the watershed itself has an incredible degree of social, economic, and environmental value. Despite its small size, it's one of the most important watersheds in the state. And I have worked in one way or another this watershed for a long time. I started my career sort of in freshwater ecosystems, working right here in Hardin and Allen County, and then as I did a lot of my graduate work was focused wholly on the Wabash River watershed. And so Grand Lake is something that I've been around for a while working on this system. The system itself is really fed by a series of 5 or 6 or 7 smaller scale tributaries. These are first or second order streams. These are basically creeks. And they fold into, or they discharge into a large reservoir, large inland reservoir. This reservoir was constructed in the mid-1830s as a means to provide a water supply for the Miami-Erie Canal. So that was the system that folks thought would really take off. That was the system that was supposed to connect the Great Lakes drainage to the Mississippi River drainage. And it did that for a number of years, and then, of course, technology advanced and it was sort of rendered obsolete. But the system itself, the watershed, is sort of artificial in a sense in that it was hand-dug. It occupies an enormous surface area, 52 square kilometers. But because of that sort of historical narrative, it is incredibly shallow, which contributes to, despite the fact that it's got an incredible surface area, it also has a very, very reduced volume. So reduced that average depth of this system is about 1.5 meters, and sometimes even lower than that. There was a situation last summer where I had a research pontoon out in the middle of the lake, and I bottomed out, literally in the middle of the lake, on a mud flat. So it's an incredibly shallow system, and that contributes to a lot of the sort of magnification and eutrophication problems that we're seeing in this watershed, because when you look at the loading that the system experiences, it comes from a combination of internal and external loading. Those half dozen or so smaller tributaries are draining a watershed that's primarily 80 to 90% row crop. Many of those row crop operations are also coupled with livestock operations. So you have an incredible amount of agricultural-based runoff that flows into this system. And when you don't have periods of high runoff, because the lake is so shallow and because the lake is so large from a surface area perspective, I mean, it's large enough you can see it from space. At one point it was the largest artificially constructed reservoir in the world. I don't think it holds that title anymore, but at one point, so this is a big system. But because it is so shallow and because of the way it's situated, it has a fairly long wind fetch length, which is the distance that wind can travel sort of unabated. It's like over 15 kilometers. So even when you have periods of low runoff, as soon as you have periods of high wind, you have internal loading of nutrients in the sediment of the actual lake. And those can get resuspended and those can get sort of reanimated and reused by the blue-green algae that's sort of negatively impacting water quality in the region. So you've got two things happening there, and the lake experiences a steady source of internal and external loading. We know that the watershed is 80 to 90% agriculture, row crop agriculture, but one of the things that makes this system unique, again, is that sort of coupling with the livestock agriculture. And there's quite a bit of livestock activity in the region. In fact, a huge percentage of the actual operations have that coupling. And when you look at the concentration of livestock in the region, it's remarkably high. If you were to look at the state of Ohio and you were to look at, say, like animal units, which is just a basic way of standardizing, livestock, because not all livestock are the same size, the same configuration, not all livestock excrete the same amount of nitrogen and phosphorus, right? So a chicken, pound for pound, is going to do, one thing, and then a cow is going to do another thing. So if you standardize them using a pretty basic metric, an animal unit, if you standardize using an animal unit, the state of Ohio's got around 21 animal units per square kilometer. That's an average. And of course, that average includes agriculture and non-agricultural areas. But just to give you a baseline to get the conversation started, in Grand Lake, that number is almost 400 animal units per square kilometer. So there's a lot of row crop agriculture and there's a lot of animals. This contributes to a huge potential for nutrient loading that we've seen, and we've seen that sort of come to a head over the last 10 or 20 years. The majority of the nutrients in the watershed are manure-based. But I don't want you to get the wrong idea. I don't want you to think that I'm anti-manure or that manure is inherently bad. In fact, I would argue very much the opposite. I very much like manure application in the sense that it's an important resource, and it's a recycled resource. There's a synergy that I really like about manure management, because if you can have your sort of row crop agricultural operation and then you can sort of have a coupled livestock, you can have those things feed back on each other. And you can create a very nice feedback loop whereby you have one system sort of helping the other system out, et cetera, et cetera. And this works out really well until there's an imbalance. And in the watershed of Grand Lake, there's been sort of an imbalance. For instance, the manure produced in the watershed is in far excess of what the soils and the crops can actually tolerate or actually handle. And so again, therein lies one of the metrics for our excessive runoff that we have. To put this in perspective, there's about 1.5 times more phosphorus and 2.5 or 3 times more nitrogen produced annually by these animal units than can actually be used. So there's already sort of an excess being applied. That excess, of course, has the high potential to run off. Runoff is not equal throughout the year. Runoff can be affected by high rain events, precipitation events. It can be affected by impervious ground. However that happens, it could be frozen, snow covered, those sorts of things. So runoff is something that has contributed greatly to the internal and external loading of Grand Lake St. Mary's. What this has actually manifested in, and again, this is not something that's happened overnight. This is something that's taken 100+ years to really develop. But what this has sort of become is it has contributed to one of the most nutrient-rich systems in the country. The land use, the actual land in the watershed, if you look across the state of Ohio, it ranks in the 90th percentile in terms of soil test phosphorus levels. If you look at the tributaries, in terms of the average nutrient concentration in the tributary or the average loading, the tributaries, these small tributaries in Grand Lake St. Mary's, rank in the 75+ percentile for NMP. And that's across the country. That's not just the state of Ohio. So extremely high. If you look at the actual lake itself, in terms of nutrient levels, it's the same. If you look at the metric of degraded water quality, like in the sense of microcystin levels and blue-green algae toxins, the lake itself ranks in the 99th percentile for the United States. So there's a huge degree of this degradation that's occurring in the watershed. 2007, there was an EPA report, a TMDL recommendation that was made for the region, and it was noted that in order to achieve sort of a baseline water quality metric of having about 0.1 milligrams per liter of total phosphorus in your streams at any given time, or somewhere around 1.5 or 2 milligrams per liter of nitrate in your stream. In order to meet that sort of baseline goal that was established, you would have to have nutrient reductions of over 90% loading at your medium and high flows, kind of throughout the year in every stream across the entire watershed. So again, it just sort of piles on that there is this issue, there is this problem. And this problem really is best sort of typified, at least in the media, was typified in the mid-2000s. So when you look at the mid-2000s, we've got harmful algal blooms that sort of take off in the region, and everybody takes notice. It's not to say the nutrients just arrived then. They've been building and building and building, but at that point in time, everyone takes notice because we have these incredible degrees of harmful algal blooms, and we have this sort of poster child of degraded water quality in the Midwest. The watershed, as a result, was declared distressed in 2011. The distressed watershed, a couple of things happened with the distressed watershed. It makes nutrient management plans a priority, and it also makes manure application, it prohibits manure application during the winter, which is one of those periods of time where you have a huge degree of runoff because you often have frozen and snow-covered ground, and at least in the state of Ohio, just because you have frozen ground doesn't mean you can't have liquid rain coming down and sort of washing things away. So the two big components of the distressed watershed ruling in this region were nutrient management plans and a winter manure application ban. But that wasn't all that was done in the watershed. This period in 2011 really signified kind of a regime shift in the way that everyone looked at the watershed and the way that the watershed was managed. And it was pretty spectacular, the sort of response that was seen. It was a response by many of the producers in the region that sort of stepped up and said, okay, let's work on this. What can we do? What sorts of things can we do on this field? Can we put a cover crop here? Can we put a buffer here? Can we do this? Can we do that? And so right about 2011, again, we have this incredible shift that occurs in the thinking, in the thought process. And this shift can really be looked at in sort of three different angles. The first one is sort of a comprehensive shift in the efforts. Comprehensively, nutrient management plans became a priority. Nutrient management plans now affect over 90% of the acres, right? So over 90% of the acres in the watershed are under nutrient management plans. Prior to this period, less than 25% had an active nutrient management plan. So this is really an incredible shift. And these are all informed, of course, by soil tests. Cover crops, they're increasing in great frequency. Huge amount of cover crops. Anecdotally, sort of driving around this winter, there seems to be a large percentage of the cover crops are actually in radishes, which is kind of interesting to see. There's constructed wetlands that are going on in the watershed. There's 2 active constructed wetlands. We're going to talk about some of those numbers and the impacts of those numbers here in a few minutes. In addition to those 2 that are active, there's one that's going to go online this summer, which is going to make a total of 3, and then there's 4 or 5 more that are sort of in the planning stages. So there's been a lot of these really big-scale, comprehensive efforts. There's also been efforts that have focused strictly on manure. Okay, obviously, we have the winter manure ban, which prohibits the application of manure on snow or frozen ground or between December 15th and March 1st. So we just came out of that period this week. There's also been a huge degree of manure storage structures. These are largely funded by an influx of EQIP dollars. Many of these conservation practices were funded by an influx of EQIP dollars. But for a watershed that's 250 square kilometers, there have been over 80 of these manure storage structures constructed between that period. Right about 2011 is when a lot of those constructions took off. There's also manure transfer efforts. I mentioned that there's 1.5 times and 2.5 times more P&N getting produced annually by the sort of imbalance of livestock in the region, and now we have a metric to deal with that. A lot of the excess manure that can't be applied to the soil is now being exported. In fact, over 90% of the chicken litter, which of course is some of the hottest manure that you've got, it's also some of the driest, which makes it some of the easiest to transport. Over 90% of that is being exported from the watershed. There's actually a market that's developed where there's actually a sale that can come from that. You can actually profit from that, which becomes a really positive thing for this watershed. There's also a series of new manure dewatering technologies. Chicken litter is not something you need to dewater, but swine manure is certainly something that you would want to dewater if you wanted to ship it. It's a lot easier to ship something if it's got less weight. So some of those technologies are being explored as well. But one of the biggest ones is this idea of communication. Communication wasn't really happening in the region prior to this period of time. Now there's a huge degree of collaboration and communication both with producers, government officials, as well as the community. And it's created this interesting effect whereby Local collaborative groups like the Lake Improvement Association or Lake Restoration Commission or Ag Solutions, local groups are sort of working together to sort of say, okay, what can we do? How can we implement this practice? How can we implement that practice? Can we bring these concentrations down? And so it's been a neat time over the last 10 or 12 years to really look at this watershed. And I'm really happy to be able to share, we could talk all day about this, but I chose kind of 3 stories to tell you today that demonstrate improvements in water quality in the region, again, over the last decade. One of which is a very large-scale, comprehensive take following the distressed watershed. What has happened since 2011? The watershed gets declared distressed. Let's follow that. Let's follow that up. Let's see what happens. So that's kind of where we're going to start. But I will tell you that when you begin a sort of restoration effort and your nutrient levels are, ranking in the 75th plus percentile in the U.S., it's going to take more than just one effort to bring those things down. And so we'll follow up that with a discussion of some of the wetlands that I just mentioned, some of the comprehensive wetlands that are actually acting as filters for some of those tributaries. And then lastly, we'll kind of finish things up with some emerging pilot projects that the group that I work with at the university and within the community is exploring. These are some pilot projects that are going to explore some innovative and newer edge of field type practices that could potentially be implemented on a larger scale, depending on kind of what we find. So, to begin with, this first kind of long-term analysis, this is a collaborative effort. I don't work alone. I work with a lot of really brilliant folks. This project worked with Greg McGlinch, who's also over at Wright State Lake Campus. Worked with Teresa Dirksen over at Ag Solutions. We communicated a lot with Terry Mesher. And in addition, we also worked with Laura Johnson over at the Heidelberg National Center for Water Quality Research. So we worked with a lot of different folks to try and put this together. The overall sort of goal of this project was simply to look for long-term trends in water quality. We're asking the question, has there been a change since the distressed watershed implementation? In the watershed, in addition to having some incredible improvements in management, an incredible degree of improvements in how we focus on the watershed from a health perspective, we also have the monitoring capabilities in the watershed. There's a couple of USGS streams gauging stations. There's also a couple of National Center for Water Quality monitoring stations. The monitoring station data I'm going to share with you today has been operational since 2008. It's situated on Chickasaw Creek, which is one of the 4 or 5 sub-basins of Grand Lake. It is one of the larger ones, and it's extremely representative of sort of the whole basin. So we talk about this data. We're talking about this long-term monitoring station that's been operational since 2008. Essentially, the approach is pretty simple. We look at a series of nutrients and flow, and we ask the question, have they changed? And I say that's pretty simple, but anybody that's worked with water quality data knows that water quality data can be kind of finicky. You have some issues with it. One of the biggest issues with water quality data is water quality concentrations and loads of nutrients. They scale non-linearly with flow, which basically means that as flow rates increase in your streams, the nutrient levels, they don't go up one for one. They don't go up pound for pound. They scale in sort of it's not quite exponential, but it looks an awful lot like that. So if you're going to ask this question, has there been a reduction in nutrients? You need to make sure that you account for flow. You need to make sure that if you had a particularly wet year or you had a particularly dry year, you need to make sure that you standardize that. And so that was one of the sort of early goals of this project, was we needed to find a way to standardize our water quality metrics so that if there was a change, we could be sure that there was a legitimate actual change and not just something due to water volume in the streams. And if you look at the top left graphic there, you're going to see year 2008 all the way to 2016. Okay, so if you look right up here, this represents our unit of flow, right, which was like million cubic liters per day. So this is on average what those streams look like. And right off the bat, there should be alarm bells going off, because not every year is created equal in terms of flow. In fact, 2011 was an incredibly wet year. 2013 to 2016, those were on average wetter years than, say, 2009, 2010, or 2012. Those were actually drier years. And so again, when you test for an effect, when you explore for an effect, you have to make sure that you sort of standardize things. Because if you have higher runoff, if you have higher precipitation, if you have higher flow, you would expect there to be higher nutrient levels. One of the things that jumps out though, and I like seeing this plot when we first sort of made this, is it doesn't take a statistician to sort of do the math and take a look at this, because if that's sort of the expectation, if there is no change and you have higher flow, you would expect there to be higher nutrients. But in fact, across the board, as flow goes up, nutrients go down. Right? That's not normal unless there's something else at work here. And in our case, there's a huge number of best management practices and management rules and regulation and increases in communication that have been ongoing since this 2011 period. And that 2011 period, again, this represents sort of a regime shift. We're right about there. You start to see things just drop. It's really pretty incredible. We focused our analysis on nitrogen and phosphorus in different species. I'm going to share with you a couple of the big ones. We'll start with nitrate. If we look at nitrate, what you're going to see here broken up is you're going to see pre and post, right? Pre and post. That represents pre-distressed watershed and post-distressed watershed. You're also going to see things broken up into flow categories. Remember, that's important. You want to make sure that you're comparing apples to apples. And in this case, if you compare a low flow event to a high flow event, that's not really appropriate. So you need to make sure that you grab your low flow events and you compare low flow to low flow, or medium flow to medium flow, high flow to high flow, etc., just so that you're speaking a common language here. And in our case, how we delineated low, medium, and high flow is we simply took the distribution of all of the flow events over the course of an entire year, and we simply took the top 33%, the mid 33, and the bottom 33, right? So we divided things up into a very equal low, medium, and high flow. And then, of course, you see this regulatory statistic down there. The regulatory period represents the manure ban period. Okay, so remember that's December 15th to March 1st, right? So that's the regulatory period. The non-regulatory period would be the period of time we're in right now. And that represents any period of time outside of that manure ban period. So that's the period of time when you can't actually apply nutrients. I should also mention that in the watershed, because we have this huge percentage of livestock, the majority of the nutrients getting applied are actually manure-based. So there is of course some commercial nutrients getting applied, particularly early on with Y drips and nitrogen and things like that. But for the most part, the nutrient base in the watershed is manure-focused. And so these regulatory periods really kind of hit at that. If we look at this, the ideal situation is when you just pick something. So here's the non-regulatory period at medium flow, pre and post. Look at this. Pre, the average concentration of nitrate in the stream was somewhere about 13 milligrams per liter. Post, it drops down to about 7. That's kind of a big deal. If we look over here at high flow during the manure ban period, before the distressed watershed period, we've got concentrations in excess of 15 to 20 milligrams per liter, and we see this post, it drops well below 15 milligrams per liter. We're seeing declines in these sorts of nutrient loads, in these concentrations in the stream. This manifests, at least during the regulatory period, of about a 20% decrease in the nutrient concentration and the loading during those periods following the distressed watershed period, right? 20%. If you look at the period of time where application is possible, so this is sort of the summer months and the fall months, we're seeing about a 40% decrease in nitrate during medium flows and about a 30% decrease in nitrate levels at high flows. It should be noted too that when you talk about water quality, you want to talk about it from a loading perspective. Okay, and what load is, when you hear that term load, what that actually is that's volume of water multiplied by concentration. And this is important because you could have, the most nutrient-rich volume of water in the world, but if it's only a gallon, it's probably not particularly meaningful. Conversely, you could have something that maybe isn't the highest nutrient level in the world, but if there's 20 million gallons a day going into a system, that could potentially be far more problematic. And so when we look at these changes, The big ticket items that we want to look at and the ones that we really want to focus on are those medium and high flow events, because those are the events that contribute by and large the majority of our loads and just a few flow events really throughout the year. If we look over at phosphorus, let's take a look at particulate phosphorus first. Particulate phosphorus is that type of phosphorus that's bound to sediment. It's that phosphorus that's bound to sediment. When we look at our pre-post values, we see decreases. We see them across the board. During the manure ban period, during that regulatory period, we see drops of almost 60% at medium flow, almost 50% at high flow. This is a big deal, because even though this phosphorus is bound to sediment, once it gets in that lake and it starts churning up and it starts moving around, it won't be bound forever. And this is going to be linked to the one that is very much available for harmful algal blooms, and that is dissolved phosphorus. We'll talk about in a second. If we look during the non-regulatory period, during the period where you could apply a nutrient, we see drops, 10, almost 15% kind of across the board from low to high flow. If we sort of flip the script and we look at the one that sort of is on everybody's mind at this point, and we look at dissolved phosphorus, we see something very promising happening during that manure ban period. We see almost a 30% decrease in dissolved phosphorus at medium flows. We see almost a 20% decrease in dissolved phosphorus at these high flows, right? So this is before the distressed watershed compared to after the distressed watershed. We're controlling for everything we can. We're focusing on these flow events. And we're seeing these incredible decreases. If we take a look over here at the non-regulatory period, this is the period of time when you can apply nutrients. At low flow periods, again, from a loading perspective, not vastly important, but still worth mentioning. We see almost a 20% decrease in dissolved reactive phosphorus. At high flow, there's really no change, but as most of you have probably keyed in on, that medium flow, that is a plus 44%. I will tell you, on average, there's been a decrease in dissolved phosphorus, but that is a problem. That is not something that you would like to see, clearly. And so one of the first things that occurred with the working group that I worked with on this is we sort of zeroed in on that. And we said, okay, we have questions. Exactly why is that happening? Medium flows during the manure application period, how could it possibly have gone up? We've seen all these BMPs, we've seen all these things go in. We know they've gone in. We've worked to help install a lot of these. So what is going on? And so what we did then is we really wanted to focus in on this DRP metric, and we really wanted to look at this in conjunction with sort of a normal agronomic year. So if you were to take a normal year, instead of dividing your year up into 12 months, let's divide it up into 4 categories of 3-month windows, right? We'll call one of those winter. That's basically your manure ban period. Then we have a pre-plant period. Then we have a growing period. Then, of course, we have our fall harvest. So these are 4 equal size month categories. Let's break it up into our low, medium, and high flow metrics like we've been doing the whole time. Let's look pre-post. This is going to be the way that you figure out the timing of when this uptick is happening. Because if you can figure out the timing, you might have some idea of the mechanism that undergirds that. So if we look at our winter period, okay, this basically matches up with this regulatory period. So this is not surprising. We're seeing a decrease. Okay, so that's good. Okay, we see the same numbers on this sort of a plot as well. If we look at our pre-plant period, though, and we look at this medium flow, this is where that uptick is. I mean, you see this jump from just around 0.1 to well in excess of 0.2 milligrams per liter. And this is just of dissolved phosphorus. When we look at sort of our baseline for healthy waters, 0.1 milligrams per liter total phosphorus, which includes particulate and dissolved, that's kind of the benchmark of where we'd like to be. So these have a huge amount of dissolved phosphorus. And this is exactly where that uptick is happening. If we look at the growing period, there's maybe a slight uptick, but there is some overlap with the variability. So that's, could just be a little bit of noise. But this is certainly something to take a look at. And what this tells us is that there's got to be a difference that's occurred in the timing of application. It's not necessarily in the quantity of application or this other thing. It's got to be in the timing, which means the timing has shifted. And that's not totally unexpected when you think about a manure application ban. What's happening there? Manure is sort of getting stored. Some of it's getting transported, but that which is getting stored, it's not going to stop getting produced, and so it's going to go out at some point. And so this is sort of very likely what's happening. This is a metric that we are exploring more and more in the region, and we're going to start, hopefully this summer, start working with some folks on potentially some education efforts on incorporation rather than surface spread. to try and bring that number down. But we're sort of keen on bringing that uptick down. In addition, bringing everything else down as well. This distressed watershed rules has sort of, again, it conjured up a massive regime shift. It would be impossible to sort of look at this and say, okay, everything is due to cover crops, or everything is due to a manure application ban, or everything is due to nutrient management plan. That would not be the most responsible thing to sort of say, like, okay, it's all due to this one thing or this one thing. In reality, that 2011 period, as I said, it signified a time when a lot of things changed, and a lot of the ways in which we look at the land and a lot of the ways in which we manage it changed as well. And so we have this incredible trend, this incredible downtick. We're seeing decreases in excess of 50% with some of these nutrients. This is a very powerful thing. Equally powerful, at least anecdotally, no negative yields were reported to soil and water offices or ODA offices. Right? So the folks that I've talked to, there have been no negative yields. I mean, this is an important thing too, right? Because this is one of the most agriculturally rich regions in the state, and so that should be preserved. But at the same time, we have to find a way to work sustainably, all right, and hopefully without sacrificing any kind of quality. So this sort of metric tells us that not only are we continuing incredible production in that region, but it's not having a negative impact, and we're moving towards a more sustainable model. But even though we've come down quite a bit, there's still incredibly elevated nutrient concentrations, and so there's still lots of efforts. There's no shortage of work in the region. There's still lots of things yet to be done. We need to continue watershed efforts. And the next thing that we're going to talk about is one of those continuing efforts in the form of wetlands. If you're interested in reading more about the long-term analysis, we analyze more than just nitrate and a couple of things of phosphorus. We analyze a lot of different nutrients, a lot of different flow. If you're interested in learning more about that, or the statistical model that we've built to handle all these different variables, this actually just came out in the Journal of Environmental Quality. We made sure that this article was open access, which means that it's totally free. Right? You don't have to have a library membership or be affiliated with a university or a government office to actually get access. So if you're interested in this, all you have to do is Google my name and Grand Lake, and somewhere in there you're going to see a link to a Journal of Environmental Quality, so you can download this and read in some more detail. Next project I want to talk about is an assessment of the sediment and nutrient remediation potential of some of the reconstructed wetlands that have been put in the region. Again, we're not there yet. Even though we've seen some incredible strides, let's see if we can bring that down even more. This next project involves, again, many of the same folks that I work with day in and day out, to look at the impact of a few of the reconstructed wetlands on Grand Lake St. Mary's watershed. Now, wetlands, as everyone here no doubt is aware of, they're an important part of any watershed. They provide countless ecosystem services, really incredible things. Increased variety of habitat for wildlife. They can act as groundwater recharge points. They can store carbon. They can act as recreation. Some of the wetlands out here have great walking trails and hiking trails around them. They can act as erosion and flood control points. But of course, one of the primary interests in this region is their capacity to improve water quality by, quote, filtering nutrients. Historically, Grand Lake St. Mary sits just on the tip of what was the Black Swamp. Okay, so coming out of the Pleistocene, the last ice age, this area of Ohio was covered with a huge swampy habitat, the Black Swamp. And in fact, the reason that Northwest Ohio has as much field tile per square mile as anywhere else in the world, that's a real number, is simply because our soils and our historical geology is a result of the Great Black Swamp. And so historically, Grand Lake St. Mary's, my point is, had lots and lots of wetlands. These wetlands have largely been destroyed and turned over. Some of these wetlands have been converted into fields. Some of these wetlands have been converted into housing developments, et cetera, et cetera. And the fact is, it doesn't really matter why they were converted. The fact is, again, the watershed lost those wetlands. So a lot of things, a lot of those ecosystem services, Grand Lake was sort of set up to have problems when you get rid of those wetlands. They're just a very vital part. The goal of this next project was to bring back some of these wetlands and then actually assess what kind of impact they're having, what kind of positive impact they're having. In general, to maximize ecological services, and we can sort of debate this number all day long, and multiple people will be right. But in general, 1 to 5% of the watershed area to kind of maximize these, 1 to 5% of the watershed area should probably be wetland. You know, if you wanted to sort of maximize these things, that's kind of the minimum. That's where you should start. So when I talk to you about the square footage of the wetlands that we've got, kind of keep that number in mind. Because the wetlands we have are not quite there yet in terms of actual size. The two wetlands we're going to talk about are located on 2 tributaries. Remember, there's only 5 or 6 tributaries, so this represents maybe 30 or 40% of the tributaries kind of covered by wetlands. One is on Prairie Creek, one is on Coldwater Creek. Prairie Creek, you can see the system right here. Prairie Creek sits on about 0.05 square miles, which is somewhere in the ballpark of 1% of the watershed area. It processes about 1 million gallons a day. Coldwater Creek, constructed a little bit more recently, sits on about 0.2% of the watershed area, and that's about 0.04 square miles, and we can see that system right here. That one has the capability to process about 2.5 million gallons a day. The basic management approach, these systems were constructed through a combination of community involvement, community donation, as well as an incredible amount of support from the state of Ohio. These wetlands were constructed to do exactly what we're going to talk about, to help to filter nutrients and mitigate some of the runoff before it gets into the lake. They are artificial in nature in terms of they're maintained by a pumping system. Because land is at a premium and you can't just put a wetland wherever you want, you got to kind of work with what you've got. That means that these wetlands are sort of revolving around a pump station. Okay, so water is pumped out of these creeks. It goes into a massive initial settling basin. Those settling basins are somewhere around 15 or 20 feet deep, and that allows the water to slow down and allows a lot of that particulate phosphorus to kind of drop out, precipitate out. And then the water passes through a series of increasingly shallow ponds that are vegetated. And we start to get a little more of those removal effects through adsorption, adsorption, and uptake. We start to see that. They operate from spring to fall. Right? They don't operate during the winter because of pumps freezing and problems like that. The maximum flows really occur during the late spring and early summer. Now, to give you an idea of how much water we're dealing with, okay? Because if I tell you that Prairie Creek processes 1 million gallons a day, and then I tell you that Prairie Creek discharges 1,000 million gallons a day, well, that's nothing. So that's not really relevant. But if we look at Prairie Creek in terms of discharge, we monitor this. So this is millions of gallons per day. Right, and then we have months. So one would be January up to December. You can see that during the high flow periods in this region, our high flow periods are typically February, March, and April. We're in it. Somewhere between right around 6, 7, 8 million gallons a day. Our low flow periods are below 1 million gallons a day, and that occurs during the late summer, early fall. If we look at Coldwater Creek, it's a little bit bigger system, much bigger system. The high flow periods, again, same story right now. These are somewhere in the ballpark of around 25 or 30 million gallons a day. And then it gets down to around 2 million gallons a day on average during some of those low flow periods. And so when we talk about the effect of these wetlands, it's important to not only document whether or not they can reduce nutrient concentrations, but getting back to our sort of loading conversation, if you reduce nutrient concentrations by 99%, but you only do that on a gallon, that's not as important as if you reduced it maybe 75% and you did it on 3 million gallons. So there's something that has to be sort of said there. So as we monitor our wetlands, we also monitor the discharge coming in and going out of the wetlands, and then we compare that to the actual volume in the stream to get an idea of our, quote, effect size. This project involves the same approach that we take with every other monitoring project. We go out, we collect as many water samples as we can, and then we simply test for phosphorus and for nitrogen, and we also look at total suspended sediments. And then we just simply compare the inflow to the outflow, and then we compare those in light of the actual volume so that we can get an idea of that sort of processing power. Focusing on nitrate first, on average during the summer period, Coldwater Creek comes in at around 5 or 6 milligrams per liter of nitrate. When it leaves at right around 1. I mean, this is an incredible thing. This actually meets that benchmark, by the way, we were talking about earlier. Prairie Creek comes in on average almost 16 milligrams per liter during the summer. And then when it leaves Prairie Creek, it leaves at right around 3 or 4 milligrams per liter. All right, so just a little bit above that benchmark of where we wanted to be. If we look at the fall, the nutrient concentrations kind of drop quite a bit, right? There's no application. There's still kind of crops on the fields for the most part. So things are anchored pretty well. There's also really low precipitation. Remember, this fall period is represented right here. And so we simply don't have a lot of runoff. As a result of that, it's not surprising that our inflowing concentrations are extremely low and our outflowing concentrations are still extremely low. So the fall, we're doing pretty good. Now, in terms of what this actually means, we're getting about 40 to 50% reduction in nitrate at Prairie Creek and Coldwater Creek during the summer. During the fall, because there's not a lot of runoff, we're still getting a reduction, but it's not as meaningful because we're starting so much lower. If we look at the actual effect size, how much water are we processing? If a wetland should be 1 or 5% of your watershed area, we're not there. So what are we actually able to do? As I said, Coldwater Creek's able to process 2.5 million gallons a day. Prairie Creek's able to process about 1 million gallons a day. This equates across the whole period to about 30 to 40% of the total stream flow gets processed through these wetlands during these summer and fall periods. This is an example of a very, very lightweight wetland fighting way outside of its weight class. It's processing a ton of water, and it's doing a good job. I mean, we're dropping nutrient levels, we're dropping that loading coefficients. It just becomes a really kind of amazing thing. Obviously, there's room to improve, right? There's still water going by. But I will tell you, this is sort of on average 30 to 40%. During some of those high flow events, during some of those high flow months, you're not going to capture as high a percentage. And during some of those low flow months, you're going to capture far more of a percent. One of the sort of interesting moments I had when I was analyzing this data, I thought that I had miscalculated something because I was identifying that there were a couple of periods in time where Prairie Creek and Coldwater Creek were processing more than 100%. They were processing more than what they were given. Now, of course, that does not add up at all. And I go out there and I start looking around. I start sort of talking to folks, looking at this, rationalizing this, and all of a sudden it becomes very obvious what's happening. If we look at the actual design of these wetlands, okay, the lake is right here, okay, and then here is the inflow. Some of this water sitting here is backflowing from the lake. When the lake is high enough, it actually backflows. And so this is a really critical component of some of these wetland systems, because during those periods of time, when you simply don't have enough runoff to actually fill the wetland, you're sort of wasting space. But not in this case. In this case, as the lake backflows, these wetlands actually filter the lake as well. They just recycle it back in. So again, this becomes sort of a positive thing. And of course, during those periods of high flow, it's not getting any of the lake, it's getting all of the tributary. But they act to do double duty, and they couldn't have done that without the pump systems that we see. But again, 30 to 40% of the total stream flow gets processed through the wetlands. Switching gears, looking at phosphorus, Coldwater Creek comes in. This is total phosphorus. We'll look at the dissolved component in a minute. But total phosphorus represents particulate plus dissolved. So if we look at the whole here, Coldwater Creek comes in at about 1.5 milligrams per liter, extremely high, and it leaves somewhere around 0.2. I mean, this is a big, big drop. Prairie Creek, sort of similar story. During the fall, you've got a little bit lower sort of runoff, so some of those numbers go down a little bit more. But we have a 75+% reduction in total phosphorus during the summer period between Prairie Creek and Coldwater Creek, 75%, which means every drop of water that goes in, when it goes out, you can expect it to have 75% less phosphorus in it than when it came in. And again, the discharge numbers don't change here. So this is the same statistic from the last slide. 30 to 40% of our total stream flow is getting processed through these wetlands. From a loading perspective, Prairie Creek during the summer processes about 5 pounds of nitrate a day, or about 3 pounds of total phosphorus a day. If we look at Coldwater Creek, that number goes up, about 60 pounds of nitrate a day during the summer. And if we look at total phosphorus, about 30 pounds of total phosphorus a day. These represent solid reductions in loading. But again, we're not done yet. There has to be a way to sort of expand or do something, right? You can add more wetlands, but again, wetlands become sometimes difficult because, quite frankly, you have to be able to find space to put them. One of the sort of solutions to this, or at least one of the best approaches to kind of expand the capacity of this, might be to go out into the lake a little bit. What would it be like if you could maybe install a sort of littoral wetland inside of the lake? And so we've got substantial load reductions due to the terrestrial wetlands, these wetlands that are, not terrestrial wetlands, these wetlands that are in the watershed. The discharge, when it leaves these wetlands, is often at that sort of recommended baseline. There are substantial load implications to recognize, but again, not done yet. The wetlands work despite their small size. We need more of them, or we need more space. Here is an example of the littoral wetland piece that's been added to Coldwater Creek. There's also a littoral wetland piece that has been added to Prairie Creek. So both these wetlands we're talking about, here you can see that wetland. Right, here's Coldwater Creek, it flows in. Here's the pump station right here. Here's that central settling basin. The water goes left, it goes right, and then it converges on a discharge point. Okay, and then the stream that flows by, here's a heavy flow event. You can see the chocolate melt coming through. That's right after a heavy rain. A lot of that is bypassing the wetland. But notice it's not actually going out into the big water of Grand Lake. It's being redirected into a little embayment, a little littoral wetland. Is this a perfect system? No, of course not. But what this is doing is this is trapping a lot of the sediment, a lot of the nutrients, before it has a chance to get out in the lake. And I can tell you, are wetlands eternal? Of course not. Is this going to be eternal? Of course not. What do I mean by that? I mean that there's a long-term maintenance sort of commitment to these things. You have to dredge them. It's not like the stuff just disappears. It's not magic. The phosphorus just gets bound up, or the nitrate gets used up, denitrified, or maybe it gets bound up too, and then it just settles into the sediment. So at some point you have to dredge it. At some point you have to dig it out. However, for those of you doing the math on this, it's a lot cheaper to handle this, and it's a whole lot cheaper to handle this central basin than it is to handle the lake. Those are much easier approaches to take. So moving forward, these littoral wetlands become a larger piece. Again, are they the end-all, be-all? Of course not. This system has experienced incredible nutrient reductions not because of any one practice, rather because of a sort of combination. Yeah.
With your periodic dredging of the littoral wetland, how do you take into account of the wildlife? Because you've got fish, and then you've got things that are actually in the sediments, that live there part of their life. How do you account for the damage done there?
It's not accounted for at this moment. And the dredging operations, these wetlands haven't even taken place yet because they're still new enough. But that's a conversation that should happen, that needs to happen. Yeah, that's a good point. And there are going to be trade-offs with any of these approaches. Yeah.
What is the structure? How is the line between the lake and the wetland built? Is that some sort of a man-made dam?
It's not a dam. It's just a big riprap wall. And these are pretty easy. Not easy. They're certainly expensive, but they're possible to construct because the lake is so shallow. I want to kind of close with a couple of the latest emerging practices. Eileen Kladivko is going to talk a little bit more about some of these practices here in the next 30 or so minutes for the next presentation. But I want to sort of share that it's never enough. You have to continue working. You have to continue making progress. And so the group that I'm working with, we've sort of taken on these different challenges and tried to do the monitoring and tried to work with some of these wetlands. But again, you have to be creative. You have to think outside the box because not every area is going to be amenable to a wetland. We're working on a system a little bit north of town. Actually, it's outside of the Grand Lake watershed, but we're hoping to, this is in the Western Lake Erie watershed, but we're hoping to be able to transport some of these results and some of these models into the Grand Lake watershed in the future. But we're working on a couple of innovative on-field practices known as saturated buffers and drainage water recycling. They're extremely simple. A saturated buffer is a system that basically acts as a means to intercept a portion of tile runoff, and it reroutes it through a riparian area. So rather than having a raw discharge pipe that goes into a tributary off of a field, you would reroute this into a riparian zone. You allow the riparian vegetation to sort of take that up. These have been installed in other places, and they show pretty significant promise, especially with reduction in nitrate, like 95% reduction. And so we wanted to sort of see, given our soils, given our climate, do they work in Northwest Ohio? Drainage water retention is the other practice we're kind of working on. This is simply a pond. Again, just take that tile main, and instead of letting it go into the stream, dump that into a pond. If you can afford to take a couple acres out of production and you have the ability to irrigate, can you sort of retain some of your drainage water. I mean, this would inevitably help boost yields by acting as a water source, especially during times of the year when you don't have water, like July and August here in Ohio. At the same time, every drop of runoff that you collect and keep on field is a drop that doesn't go into the stream. So we've got a site in Van Wert, Ohio, just 45 or so minutes from here, where we've got a buffer and we've got a couple of ponds and an irrigation setup. This is about a 100-acre site. 75 of those acres are under irrigation. We've got monitoring stations all over the place. That's what all the dots are. Same sort of approach we always take. Again, just go out, collect a bunch of water samples, and simply assess the nutrients and see what's happening. This represents pond volumes. We've got two ponds, a small pond and a large pond. Small pond's about 2 million gallon. The small pond's about 1 million gallon. The large pond's 2 million gallon. We were able to keep these ponds fairly well stocked with water, and we were able to put an irrigation event between August 8th and 14th. We put on about 2 inches of rain per acre over 75 acres. This resulted in about a 15 to 20 uptick in bushels per acre for corn production in 2017. And you can see this period of time where these things draw down. This is a really, really new project. And so we're still sort of working through some of the preliminary data. You guys are actually one of the first groups to see this. But this is going to quickly becoming one of our focal points with some of these systems. Our saturated buffer system acts as a means, again, to intercept tile drainage. Sometimes it accepts water, and sometimes, because it's a tile, sometimes it actually discharges water. Every single one of these peaks above this zero line represents a drop of water that normally would have gone into the stream sort of unabated. And in this case, every one of these peaks. And some of these peaks are pretty substantial. Some of these peaks for a 24-hour period are 250 gallons a minute. That's a huge volume of water. That's a huge loading coefficient that's being sort of saved from going into the actual streams. Our data seems to suggest that we've got 75+% reduction in nitrate and about a 50% reduction in dissolved phosphorus using the saturated buffer practice. And so again, we are in the very early stages of a multi-year monitoring project on this. And we anticipate continued loading reductions, continuing improvement at this site. But again, it's something that's sort of extra. It's that sort of extra innovative piece of on-field technology that I thought would be neat to sort of pair with some of these tried and tested metrics that we've already talked about. And again, long term, we'd like to bring more of these into the actual watershed. This stuff is so important, no matter what form it takes. If you want to improve water quality, you have to take an innovative approach. We don't have much of this stuff. We don't have much fresh water. It comprises a fraction of the global hydrosphere. But yet, it acts as home, and we're talking about biodiversity, it acts as a home to greater than 6% of the described global biodiversity. Fresh water, though, is under threat worldwide. This isn't a Grand Lake problem. This isn't an Ohio problem. This is a global issue that we have to work together to fix. We have to work together to approach. The taxa that are imperiled globally are imperiled as a result of this. To give you an awful statistic, up to 20% of freshwater fish are extinct, have gone extinct over the last 100+ years because of human activities and involvements in degrading water quality. My point is, we get one shot at this. We've got an obligation to study this, study aquatic systems, and we have an obligation to preserve them, not only for ourselves, but for the future. So with that, I say thank you very much for your attention.